morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. We start with another week in which it feels as though we've lived a couple of lifetimes since Matthew, you and I were talking last Monday. We're trying to do as close as it gets to a little life as normal this morning in thinking about one of the subjects that was central to the conversation through the course of the CBI annual conference a couple of weeks ago, which was skills and transforming the capabilities and by implication the productivity of the UK economy. And we're delighted that Tara Alice, who is the Director of Research and Economics at McKinsey, is here. Tara, thank you so much for making the time. Lee Probert, who is the CEO and Principal of York College, is here, and Neil Morrison too, the HR Director at Severn Trent. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll hold fire on the 2020 skills revolution for just a couple of minutes, because it feels as though it would be useful with Matthew Fell, who's the CBI Policy Director. Matthew, just to see if we can do a bit of catch up on last week and then talk a little bit about the agenda for this week. Shall we start with the COVID-19 to-do list and what you made of the developments of last week?
Yeah, well, thanks, James, and good to pick up on that conversation we were having just 7 days ago. I think my first thought, James, is sometimes it feels like good news is hard to find in these times. So a few bits, if you scratch around on it, of encouragement last week. One, of course, was without jinxing it, we were starting to hear much more encouraging signs around a vaccine and so on, and how that is progressing well. So that would be obviously a very significant game changer for the country if we can get that right. And as well as that, I think some news that the R number was starting to head in the right direction across the country as a whole, and of course announcement of 2 new mega labs in terms of testing capacity coming on stream early in the new year. So a few bits of encouraging news there. A couple of things then we did speak about last Monday that filled quite a lot of my time last week in conversations with government and so on. First was around the lockdown and what happens after the 2nd of December. We talked about just the importance of being really clear on what happens there. We did hear from the Business Secretary, Alok Sharma, at the tail end of last week, saying and reiterating that this lockdown, a national lockdown, will end on the 2nd of December, and we will go back into a tiering system again. So that was a little bit of clarity there from the government that we're chasing down, because we did see, I think, both examples in Wales and in Northern Ireland last week of both sort of good and also bad ways of handling this exit from a lockdown. And we've also started to hear from businesses just the importance in people like food, restaurants of perishable goods, but also in manufacturing and lead times and so on. Just the importance of knowing what situation we're going to pitch into so you can get ready and prepared for when that is the case. So we're pressing hard this week for what tiers are parts of the country likely to land into, what will be the basis on which they will be determined so that companies can keep an eye on that and do their own scenario planning and so on, and critically, when will we know? So pushing for a lot of clarity around lockdown and what happens after the 2nd of December. And then on workplace testing, the other big issue that we touched about a week ago, we've been in good conversations with government around that, and also hosted a CBI member roundtable last week to give us plenty of insight in terms of what companies are looking for. My sense on that is that around the incentives and upsides for business, why would I do this, particularly when public testing is coming on stream at a reasonable pace as well. Many companies were saying, if we could get into a world where I was able to operate a test and release system, so any of my employees who tested negative were able to then continue to work and be in the workplace, that would be really significant help for them. And also the sort of, if we could fix the issues around the test and trace app, which are sort of pinging off if people are working in relative close proximity, even when they're wearing and protected by PPE kits and so on, that again would be a significant incentive for companies to roll out workplace testing. So that was some useful insights there. In terms of prioritization, we put across the messages about making sure that key workers and enabling industries are very much at the front of pack for using this. And we also helped with the government talk them through what guidance would be helpful for businesses And something we heard from our round table is that most companies were saying, look, we're hearing lots about different types of testing capability. There are different types of tests and so on. Can you just help us understand, for my type of business and my type of workplace setting, what would be appropriate for me? And if it is, where do I then go to get help and advice, and where do I actually go about procuring this stuff and things like that? So that was on the guidance side, and finishing off with implementation. How do I talk to my employees about it and so on? So some really good headway there, and we're starting to make progress and feeling like that might be able to kick in a few weeks' time for many, many more businesses.
Matthew, thank you. That's really helpful and interesting about tiering and terms of tiering on the exit. I suspect that, given that one rather prominent UK employee is currently self-isolating because he was in proximity to someone who tested positive, there's going to be quite a lot of thinking around this test and release issue and the length of quarantine, and I suspect you'll get quite a lot on that subject, because obviously it transforms the value of testing, and it also transforms the way in which companies work and backfill. Can I just raise one other thing, Matthew, that was bouncing around last week, and I'm interested to know how much incoming you've had on that, was the Chancellor's cancellation of the retention bonus. You've heard quite a bit from businesses, at least in the press, about it. I don't know how much the CBI has heard.
No, James, we have. It's absolutely right. In terms of our virtual mailboxes and so on, it's been a big theme of last week. Lots of companies saying it's an example of chopping and changing, if you like. My sense on the job retention bonus is, when it was introduced, most companies were saying, actually, it's things like the furlough scheme that are so much more valuable to us. But clearly then the job retention bonus, it was announced, and companies have factored it in to their planning, and particularly their 2021 budgets. And we'd heard from a number of businesses how they had intended to use that job retention bonus. Some were talking about it as a reward for their employees who'd absolutely gone the extra mile during very, very difficult circumstances over the course of this year. Others were saying, look, we plan to invest that money back into the business to enhance our capabilities and our productive capability and so on. So quite a lot in terms of levels of noise, as you put it, on the inbound traffic. The situation is, I think that is understood, and we put that across loud and clear to the government. There is a question mark about, you described it as cancelled. I think it's on pause at the moment until we see what happens in early Q1. But obviously that doesn't tackle companies' uncertainty about whether they can plan around it anymore now. So it's a headache for businesses, but we are still in conversation to say, actually, will it follow on when we get into a situation when the economy can begin to reopen again, and the furlough scheme potentially after Q1 next year begins to taper off again. James, I think you popped onto mute. James, I'm not sure we can hear you at the moment. Well, perhaps, James, you're grappling with the technology a little bit at your end. One of the critical bits that's moving around at the moment is clearly on Brexit. So maybe I just give people a quick update on that. You will have seen, some of you, that we made a further intervention in the Times Red Box this morning, just emphasising the importance and urgency of getting clarity on a deal to help companies plan around that. I think a couple of bits to say. One is, we mentioned we've got this task force up and running with Michael Gove, the CBI, business organisations and other businesses meeting now on a weekly basis to work through issues. We talked last week around advanced manufacturing. This week we're focusing on agri-food, the week after on services and so on, really to work through the absolutely key issues on that. For example, around customs arrangements, how to prepare and mitigate around delays at the border, rules of origin and so on. And then the message that's absolutely loud and clear from us this morning is we must get this sorted as soon as possible, because we're now into real crunch decision moments. Supermarkets not knowing, can they get meat, fish, dairy products across and exported into Northern Ireland. Manufacturing components being ordered without knowing what the basis of rules of origin are going to be. So what is the cost of those in real terms going to be? And then once we've got a deal, critically being able to move on to data adequacy, so important for service industries. So real message, get this deal done.
Matthew, thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, all good.
Yes. Okay. Good. But Matthew, you've turned into such an accomplished politician now that you can actually not only answer questions but ask your own questions and answer them. That is now that you've really landed it. Well, listen, let's get into the subject of the day if we can. Matthew, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I'm really interested to hear what Tara Alice has to say to start with. Tara, on this subject, as I said, the one area of agreement that there was at the annual conference, given a year where many people have different priorities and points of view, was around skills and adult education and how we transform capabilities in the UK. Can you start just by giving us a sense of how the UK is faring by comparison with other developed economies, and what you think the UK needs to do to transform its performance in this area?
Absolutely. So thank you very much for having me this morning. This is one of the topics on which I've personally been very, very passionate. I've always looked at the UK kind of makeup and thought, well, we're a knowledge-based, people-based country essentially, but we don't seem to be investing in our human capital in the same way that we invest in infrastructure, for example, or we invest in new kit, new technology, new equipment, and so on. So it is a kind of broad and important theme. What's really interesting is that I would, it's hard to make international comparisons. Our adult skills levels are, not terrible and not brilliant when we compare to, let's say, other OECD countries. What is a little bit more concerning is indeed that point about whether people actually get lifelong training and learning. And again, no country in the world has really kind of cracked this. In a lot of countries, even the kind of higher training levels that we see, they tend to concentrate in the age group of 18 to 24-year-olds, and beyond that, they kind of taper off a lot. And also, as I'm sure we will come on to talk about later on, they also tend to concentrate on more highly educated people. So highly educated people tend to get a lot of lifelong learning from their employer or through personal initiative, and less skilled people less so. So there are all these kind of nuances that are important. The bottom line, though, is that the skill shortages that we already have are going to be made worse by both kind of long-term trends such as automation and digitization, and indeed the kind of COVID situation, which has really catapulted many people into the 21st century in terms of their use of IT, cloud-based services, the way they interact with their customers much more digitally, and so on. And with that in mind, when we look at 2030, we're looking at pretty much everybody. So 9 out of 10 people in the workforce having to somehow reskill, whether that's a kind of top up of their existing skill space, what you might call upskilling, or whether it's a complete retraining because their job has just been made completely redundant because automation or machines are able to do it better. And that's a large number of people. And of course, then there are specific types of skills that we will need specific attention around, things like digital, but many other areas as well.
Tara, do you have, just out of interest, I mean, what you're saying is fascinating and devastating, let's be frank. Do you have a sense of the gap, the mix between upskilling and complete retraining, i.e. when you look across the decades, what percentage of people are going to be able to take what they've got and advance, and what people are going to need to retrain entirely?
Yeah, so it's very hard to predict in any kind of precise numbers, but very, very roughly speaking, let's say about 30 million people in the workforce today need to reskill or upskill in some way. Probably about 25 million of those is more on the kind of upskilling side of things, topping up what they already have and just learning new skills on the job or in the context of their roles and their jobs. And maybe the 5 million is more about the entirely retraining, because whatever they trained for in the past has now become redundant. But of course, it's not a truly black and white kind of distinction. And in fact, as we move more forward, it's probably quite helpful. It's helpful to categorize things, but it's also helpful to remember that there is a lot of kind of nuance when we talk about skills, and it's not one thing. There are lots of different ways to pick up new skills.
Sure. Sure. I appreciate that. And as we're learning in 2020, there's not much point making predictions. Things, happen. But the reason I think it's massively helpful, that scale of problem and also that mix, because it does suggest how much of it's going to have to be dealt with inside businesses and inside companies versus, if you like, outside of them as public policy. And with that in mind, I just wanted to come to Neil, if I might. Neil Morrison, just listening to Terra and just, those things, skills investment happening for people 18 to 24, sort of skewing in favor of those people who are already highly educated, but a clear need for people developing skills within the businesses they're already in. When you sit inside Severn Trent and think about it, you must have a vast range of people doing very, very different things. And so how do you approach this problem?
Yeah, so I think we see three groups of people. We see those people who say, I'm happy in my job, but I actually want to learn more. I want to keep on top of what I do as a job. We see a group of people that say, I want to change jobs. I want to go and do something different, do a different career. And then there's a third group, which is I have to change jobs because something is either coming on in terms of automation or organization that means that I need to do something different. And we kind of articulate 5 principles around this. The first of which is we can all learn new skills. So really clearly, we believe that everybody is capable of doing that. The second one is we're all capable of changing direction if we want to. Third, we talk about technical competence because we are a technically driven organization. So that focus on it doesn't matter where you are and what you do, but you can drive your technical competence. And then the fourth, I think, is really critical to this, is we can all achieve regardless of academic background, because people come into our workforce from very, very different academic backgrounds. Some people with engineers with doctorates and academic qualifications as long as their arm, and some people at 16 coming into an apprenticeship scheme. And then the last, which is we can all make a difference to our communities, because we fundamentally believe that the skills of our workforce influence the experience of our communities, both in terms of direct service, but also in terms of economic prosperity and well-being.
And Neil, can you tell me, though, that there are 2 big things that I wonder about adult education. The first one is whether or not there is a good enough marketplace for adult education qualifications, i.e. what's recognised and needed by Severn Trent may not be seen in exactly the same way by the CBI or by McKinsey, for that matter. Is that a fair criticism of the way in which adult education works? That was my first question.
I think the answer is it depends. I think it depends on the aspect of the employee's work. So if you look at some quite specific areas of our operation, I would say the answer is no, that the adult training market doesn't meet our needs. If you look at more generic areas, finance, HR, some of those areas which are inter-industry transition, then I think it is pretty well established and works quite well. But I think.
Yeah, sorry, Neil, go on.
No, go on, please, Jess.
I guess the second question I just wanted to get to, which was, I think people would see your principles and welcome them. Most people are not initially sympathetic to the pressures on the company to invest in skills and training. And I just wondered whether or not, if you look at it from a purely Severn Trent corporate point of view, whether or not the incentives are there for you to make the training investment, or whether or not in some ways it's actually more economic to say, look, people will churn through the business and we can pick up people with the skills we need in the marketplace.
So we're firmly in the first category. So we've invested £10 million in a new state-of-the-art academy to make sure that we can drive the technical competence of our workforce, because we see a direct correlation between the skills of our workforce, our operational performance, and our operational performance to the lives of customers, because we're providing an essential service. And I think we can articulate that clarity of perspective. I think the real challenge for people within the profession and other professions is being able to articulate the link to that operational performance, because it doesn't make sense to constantly be going out and bringing people in and creating that lack of kind of cohesion within an organization if you can create and develop that internally.
Right. And just out of interest, that is, I can appreciate the cultural significance of that and the community aspect of it. Economically, presumably you get asked as well whether or not the economics add up of creating your own academy, doing your own investment in training.
Yeah, absolutely. And the nature of our business is one that we are rewarded for providing the quality of service to customers. And so if we can reduce leakage, for example, we're incentivized to do that. And if we can train our workforce to be able to better do that, then that provides a better service for customers, a better environmental and societal impact, but also, financial reward for us as an organization as well.
Yeah. Well, Lee, forgive me, I'd rather put the cart before the horse this morning, actually, given that you're the person who probably is thinking about how you deliver that kind of training and adult education. Will you tell us a little bit, firstly, about what you think personally about how you tackle this problem, and also a little bit about how your college is trying to address it?
Thanks, James. Good morning. I think step one really is to be talking to and listening to employers to understand what it is that are the skills demands that they've got. But what I would say is that there are two important things in taking that step. The first is not to presume that employers is in any way a useful term for bringing sort of coherence to the dialogue. Employers are all different. And the second thing, from my perspective, is to acknowledge that the term we use for skills applies it in a different way to different businesses at different times. And if I reflect on my, sorry, James, did you try to come in there?
No, I was humming agreement.
Sorry. And the second is the issue of skills. And of course, we use this term skills as if it covers all bases. And of course, it has to. But sometimes it's an immediate labour issue, and other times it's a long-term planning issue. And of course, as we've just heard from Neil, where employers are well in that space and thinking ahead, then they're able to partner with the system in order to make positive influences. Now, in York College, we work very closely with a range of employers, and often we'll have somebody who feels much more like part of their business than perhaps they do ours in understanding skills and training needs, developing aspects of qualifications that best link to the business, and also navigate through the complexities of the wiring in the system, whether an employer is using their own levy, whether they're drawing down other funding, whether an individual is taking out a loan. To some extent, that they're all enabling issues that the provider can help the employer to navigate through. And that's one of the things that I would say that is an important role that your college or indeed any training provider would be doing on your behalf. The precision is the key, though, James, I would say, in working out what it means. When somebody says, I've got a skills problem, working out with some certainty what it is, and trying to navigate through public policy, which largely deals in full qualification.
Can I ask about that from the labour market end, Lee? Because when you think about the way we approach education for children and young people, we actively encourage a lack of precision, right? There's an idea that part of the education is that you're learning what it is to be part of society, a citizen. Don't rush to make your mind up necessarily what you want to do when you're older. When you're looking at adult education, the precision that you expect from employers is understandable. What's your advice to employees, to people who are considering upskilling or retraining? How precise should their expectations be of the new skills they're trying to pick up? Or is the process of education, adult education itself, valuable?
I think it's both and. I think the process itself is valuable, and often when we get into conversations with employers about skills, they will also talk to us about things which might be regarded as generic, such as the ability of an individual to engage and communicate with their peers. That how well can they write? How numerate are they? How well do they pitch up in themselves? That they're all things which anybody could be working on and seeking to develop and deploy positively in thinking about entry to the labour market or change of their position in the labour market. I think when it comes to the specific technical skills, if you want to pursue a particular field, then it is going to be helpful to understand what that field is, what the demands of that sector are, and therefore to have an understanding of what sorts of qualifications or ways in which you might certify those skills are going to get you there. But I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive factors in contemplating how you might pitch up and work out how to enter.
Lee, I just want to go to Matthew, if I might, because Matthew, some people, when they listen to this conversation, the skills conversation in the UK, it's a bit like the productivity conversation. Do you know what I mean? It's a bit like, good grief, Charlie Brown, we're going to have this conversation again. When you're talking to government, there is a sense that they get this as the problem, but do you have a sense of what the interventions are going to be, what the solutions might be that are going to make a real difference?
Yeah, thanks, James. I think you're right to hit upon that as an issue, actually, because I think even when we were doing this piece of work, some people said, well, isn't it always the case that over time, many years, we're always having to evolve and adapt and retrain? And I think the answer to that is partly true, but I think there is something now about the pace of change that we're going through and the extent of it that's different. And part of that is fueled, as Tara was saying, by AI, digital, automation, and so on. I also think then that COVID has accelerated it for many businesses, even if it was rapid already. This year has brought about change more and more. So I think there's some things that we need to fix to say, and these are the conversations with government, what are the right incentives and encouragement for business? And I would include on that list sort of fixing and taking debates around the apprenticeship levy off the table. I think actually not only is it a problem in its own right in terms of how restrictive it is, but actually it's quite a stumbling block now to being able to make further inroads into this conversation, because you try and have a conversation with any business about investment in training and you'll fall at that first hurdle because they'll start complaining about the apprenticeship levy. So I would say you've got to kind of fix that and move on. We know also there are issues, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, so further incentivizing them is part of our recommendations, potentially through sort of training tax credits and so on, where the numbers don't necessarily add up for them in their own right. And then supporting individuals through this as well, so that they can actually invest in the time in their own development and so on. Those are really important roles for government. But then I think where COVID shines a real light on it, and this is where I think we should go with the policy next, is that we know as soon as possible, to maximize our chances of a good recovery, we need to be thinking about job creation. Some of those businesses and industries will change and evolve. Some actually will shrink over time, but others will grow. We're hanging our hats quite a lot on green jobs and green skills, on digital skills, on health and social care and so on, industries which everyone, there is broad consensus, are going to be growth areas in the future. But to then make that useful, I think we need to get into this under the skin of those particular skill areas. So take green jobs and the green revolution, for example. What is going to be the pathway to making that happen? What are the actions that we need to take in the next 5 and 10 years to make that 2050 net zero target a reality? And we know it's going to involve things like retrofitting boilers in people's houses. It's going to need a rollout of an EV charging network right around the country to persuade us all to make the transition to electric cars and so on. If we can get really granular on what some of those changes are going to be and understand that the skills we need to be able to roll out those changes, that I think is where it can then get much more productive as a conversation. And as Lee was saying, we can specify from a business perspective, these are the skills we need to make it happen, and then get into a conversation about how do you train for those skills and encourage people to move into those jobs because they can see a really good career pathway of growth in the future.
Thank you. Tara, would you follow up on that, on how you do make it granular, how you make that effective, and particularly, if you like, answer your own question about the inequality problem that's going to arise in terms of age, but also socioeconomic background and geography?
Absolutely. So I think that's, you know, I think Neil already has implied this, and Lee as well. There's sort of like two different groups of people. One is a group of people where it's absolutely eminently sensible for the employer themselves. So this would particularly be larger employers to do the reskilling and the upskilling and the retraining, because it's just a positive business case. They basically are contributing to society by doing it, but ultimately they're really contributing to their shareholders and indeed the well-being of their workers. So in those cases, getting granular means essentially having a strategy for your business and then working backwards from that to say precisely what types of jobs are we going to need, what roles are we going to need, and then doing a skills audit to understand to what degree does your existing employee base have those skills. And where you find big gaps, then of course looking at those gaps and saying, well, does it make sense if it's a small number of people for us to just hire into these roles? But if it's a larger number of people, it's probably not even feasible for you to basically lay off the people who don't have the skills and rehire the people who do. There aren't going to be all those people in the labor market if everybody does this. So it's a kind of, for larger businesses, it's fairly linked into their strategy and doing those kind of skills audits and then utilizing the marketplace to capture the skills. For the people who might fall between the cracks, whether they work for small businesses who don't have that capability or who have been laid off, I think government will need to step in. And Germany is an interesting example where they've turned their job centers essentially into skills centers, where they do that kind of analysis on an individual basis, but they're also in touch with all the employers in their local area to understand for those employers, what are the jobs that are going to be opening up in the next year or two, and therefore what does it make sense for individuals looking for jobs to retrain in or to upskill in. So it's a kind of very much of a collaboration then between public service and employers. That doesn't address your point about really the inequality, and I think on that front, I think, you know, it's a similar kind of thing. You know, the employers need to have incentives to also reskill their lower educated people, and some do, and you know, we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that none of them will do, but I think many will need a bit more of a nudge to consider this fact that it is often much cheaper to retrain your own people than to fire and hire.
Tara, sorry, just out of interest, that German point, so are they called jobs and skill centres? Is that a job centre in Germany is a jobs and skills centre, or they just use their job centres to provide skills, access to skills training?
To be honest, I don't know what the word is either in German or how it would translate into English, but you know, the actual activities that take place are very much engaging with the individual and, you know, working together with them to figure out what skills they need in order to have a successful, you know, long-term job in the community that they're part of.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in that business of where you can steal the best ideas, because I know, for example, to Matthew's point about supporting individuals, there's been a lot of discussion about that Singaporean model of having, you know, training credits and skills credits, and whether that works. I'm gonna go back to Lee and then back to Neil in a moment, if I might. But Lee, what do you make of Matthew's point too, which is trying to make sure that the providers of adult education are focused on these specific areas of support for SMEs, yes, you know, support for individuals, but this critical point about being quite, you know, to your point, precise about what things like the green and digital revolution are going to mean and the skills that will need to go with it.
Well, I agree with Matthew about the need to do those things. I think there is also a role for providers in stimulating interest in that sort of retraining availability. So in York, for example, there's quite a drive to do some of that retrospective fitting out of homes to make them greener. But there is also a really important job for us to do with the likes of the LEP and or the local authority in stimulating that those smaller and perhaps independent sole traders to come back and reacquire those skills that will enable them to be part of that kind of green revolution in housing. So I think there are important components that we play together, but completely agree with Matthew's point around specificity of pinning down what those skills are, so that we can properly deliver them.
And Lee, you're probably
James, if I could
closest
just
to
jump
it.
in, I
What do you
think
make?
Lee's
Yes,
point,
go on.
actually, the power of local in this is really rather important as well, because each part of the country will have its own different sources of sort of competitive advantage, natural areas of strength as well. And I think that local convening is really important in the way that Lee's just described it in York, for example. That should be happening right around the country, so that you can understand the nuances of the businesses in those areas and the skills that they need. What are the areas of competitive advantage in that part of the country, and bringing together then the education and training providers such as the colleges like Lee, probably also the unions as well, to get involved where that is appropriate to do so. So you can really understand that local labour market dynamic and how that is going to change in coming years. I think that convening is really an important part of the solution.
And Lee, so the one other thing I wanted to do was just follow up on Tara's point about inequality. When you're looking at applicants, are you seeing what Tara describes, i.e. more young people applying for adult education than older ones, more people who are already highly educated applying rather than those who have not got as many qualifications? Do you see what she describes happening in practice?
Not yet, but I think that will just be the time delay between people finding their feet, whether they're within or without the labour market, and working out what their routes to re-entry are going to be. But we do expect to see a different type of adult learner coming to us now than we might have seen in previous recessions, where we might historically have had a greater focus on developing literacy and numeracy, supporting people with job application skills or whatever it might be. We anticipate now seeing people who've got all of those basic skills, perhaps they've got high level qualifications such as the colleagues that Neil referred to in his organisation, and working out how they use the skills they've already got and the qualifications they've already got, and what are the complementary training needs that they can have access to in a college like this, or indeed anywhere else across the country. So we are expecting some different characteristics amongst the unemployed as we move into 2021.
Lee, thank you. Neil, can I just come back to you just for a few minutes as we get towards the end of this conversation? I'm really aware that there will be a lot of businesses on this call thinking we completely share your ambitions and values, but how do we actually do this practically? How do we finance it? And if we're not a company of the scale of Severn Trent, how do we coordinate it? Can you tell us a little bit about that? And if you would, just pick up on Matthew's point about the apprenticeship levy. Is it a way of helping address this, or is it a sideshow?
Yeah, so maybe if I start with that point. So I think in many ways we're long been people that have argued that flexibility within the apprenticeship levy is absolutely needed to maximise the benefit that we can get from it. And I do think it does become, as Matthew said, a bit of a distraction in terms of any conversations and debates. We know that we, as an organisation, could probably double or triple our impact in terms of employment if we were to have more flexibility on the apprenticeship levy. So, but that is where we are, and so we have to use it in the most effective way that we can at the moment. I think in terms of practicality, the key is really bringing together, if you like, the operational or business colleagues who are focused on the long-term goals and outcomes of the organisation with people who understand skills and speed to competence. Because quite often we look at these situations in too short a time frame. We say we need to deliver this next year, and the reality is to retrain or reskill people takes a year, 2 years, 3 years, and therefore you're always out of whack, and therefore it ends up being much quicker to just go out and try and hire. And so one of the steps I think that that is really pragmatic is that longer term conversation and focus between, if you like, the operational colleagues. We have an operating board who come together and talk about their 2, 3, 4 year agenda in terms of skills, so that we can then provide the solutions and the interventions to that. And if you've got that time, you can then partner with organizations externally. You can look at building the capability internally. But it's much easier then to make the strong commercial arguments about why you need to do it, because it's connected right back to operational performance and organizational outcomes and goals. So I think that's pretty critical. I think the other thing is, and I'd like to, if I can, just come back to this piece around kind of inequality, because I think there's something around as well about assessment that's really important in this space, that we do a lot of kind of on-the-job assessment and coaching assessment with people who haven't necessarily got the academic background or record or confidence even in their academic capability. That if we want to try and reskill people, we need to find different ways of assessing their competence over a period of time, so that we can help them to get those skills versus traditional methods, which might be written or oral kind of presentation, which some people just don't feel confident with.
And Neil, just that before I just go back to Matthew to finish up, just how much is there also a problem of people not putting themselves forward, not thinking that if you've done one job, you could necessarily have the capacity to do another? And what do you do about that, if that's okay?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, going back to the principles that we articulate, we talk about this, everyone can change direction, because I think people do have limiting beliefs. They say, I've been doing this for X number of years, I can't change. It's quite hard to break down that perspective without having role models who've done it and people you can signpost to say, well, actually this, one of my team worked in resourcing. They're now a drone pilot for the organization. You can start to share these little stories with people that help them to understand that it is possible. But it's also about the individual bringing forward that curiosity to learn and that desire to learn and develop new skills as well. And I think that's where organizations create that culture that supports that.
Neil, thank you. I'm sure it's easier. Unfortunately, in my business, we don't have the capacity to recruit drone pilots, but I'm sure it's easier to be able to convince people of the attractiveness of changing when one of those things on the table is becoming a drone pilot. Matthew, just as we come to the end of this, I think people are really aware that quite how much is on the government's agenda at the moment, long and short term. Can I just take you back to the point you made right at the start about how things emerge out of December the 2nd? And this is an England lockdown, I know, but what you're expecting the government to come up with, not just in terms of tiering, but forward thinking into 2021.
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, I think in terms of our agenda for this week, that is one of the key things to push. So I think what we emerge into as of the 2nd of December, that's going to be top of our engagement with government this week. I think the other bits that are on our mind are then Brexit this week and next feels like the absolute critical moment. So we're going to be focusing an awful lot on that in conversations. And then two other issues really that hopefully then start to tee us up for the recovery. One is there is a window opportunity around business rates. Again, one of those topics that's been with us forever and a day, it feels like almost, but it does feel like there is a window to substantially overhaul that in a way that feels fairer right across the business community to more people. And then the final one that's on our agenda for this week, James, that we're on the lookout for, been quite widely trailed, this 10-point plan from the government around a green recovery. Again, I think that should begin to provide some of the regulatory and legislative certainty in that framework that companies can then start to invest behind, both in terms of the skills that we're talking about today, but also getting capital deployed to begin investing in that transition that we so absolutely need. So those are the things that are on our hit list for this week, James, in terms of some of the priorities.
I love the way the world we're in now works, which is like all we've got this week is future of the UK post the pandemic, Brexit, and the Green Revolution. All right, well, let's see if we can get that done this week. That would be a good to-do list, Matthew, by any measure. CBI at 10 will be back on Wednesday. Please do join us for that. I just wanted to say a big thank you to Tara Alice from McKinsey, Neil Morrison from Severn Trent, and Lee Probert from York College. A really fascinating way to start the week. And of course, as ever, thank you to Matthew Fell from the CBI. Have a good day and a good week, everyone.